prequels carry this inherent risk of feeling boring or unnecessary because if you already know the timeline of the game's universe, you might think that the story won't progress in any way, or you won't learn anything new, and that feels bad. But for the Outlast Trials, nothing could be further from the truth. Knowing what we know of Outlast 1 and Outlast 2, which both occur 50 years ahead, only makes the mysteries presented by the Outlast Trials all the more intriguing. We have to wonder, what becomes of the trials by 2013? Are they still ongoing? Did they end in another security failure? Did they end up producing anything other than sleeper agents? And if so, or if not, what did they end up achieving? Rudolf Wernicke, the head of Outlast 1's Mount Massive Asylum experiments, oversaw the trials in 1960. Why did he end up leaving for Mount Massive when the trials were proving themselves to be such a big success? But one of the biggest questions of all concerns the fact that in Outlast 1 and 2, we learned a thing or two about Murkoff's long history. Why, throughout all that, did we never hear a single whisper of the trial's existence? There's this thing that a lot of storytellers do. They create setups for future conflicts so that the story has a forward path to tread. Similarly, they can give hints about or make allusions to past events so that there's a history to build upon and flesh out, and which informs the environment of the present day. The Outlast Trials doesn't have that. There was no precedent for the 1960s Lathe 2 project in any of the Outlast 1 nor 2's evidence documents or anything, other than this lone hint from the Outlast series Switch trailer released in 2017. Two natural explanations come up for why this is, and you might have landed on them yourself already. The first is a meta explanation, and it's that when Red Barrels was making and writing the 2013 games, the concept for the Outlast Trials just didn't exist in their heads at the time. The second explanation serves as an in-universe one, which is that Lathe 2 was such a secretive project that neither Miles nor Wayland nor Blake could read about it anywhere, even when they were digging through Murkoff's most confidential documents. Even though I think the meta explanation is more likely, the writers at Red Barrels are regardless going to have to figure out a way to explain why we don't end up hearing about Lathe 2 and why we don't end up hearing about certain characters. Because we have Clyde Perry, Sullivan Noth, and Wernicke who show up in the 2013 games, but there's a bunch of new introductions in the Outlast Trials whose names never end up showing up at all. Easterman, Amelia, Doris, Henrietta, Noakes, Barlow, Avellanos. Do they live until the present day, or are they dead by 2013? And why have we heard or seen nothing about them, about Easterman particularly, who has become so central to this huge Murkoff project? We have to back up and first make the speculation simple for ourselves, since when it comes to Lathe 2, I suppose there's only two main outcomes to consider. Either the project was shut down, or it is still ongoing in the universe's present day of 2013. Evidence for the latter? We know that the Signal facility, where Lathe 2 took place, is still active by the events of Outlast 2, because this is where Outlast 2's radio blasts are coming from. These radio blasts cause a person to hallucinate and relive their most traumatic memories. But the Signal facility is strange. The radio towers and the trials are both part of this same facility, but one of the two being active doesn't necessarily mean the other is as well. It's possible that by 2013, the trials have been shut down, but the radio towers are in use. Evidence for that outcome. This is only circumstantial, but it would probably become harder and harder as time went on to collect easily vanishable reagents for the trials. CCTV becomes a thing, social media becomes a thing, even the most marginalized of people would have many more social connections and public visibility, and this would make disappearing them from society much more unfeasible. Seeing this, Murkoff might have wanted to move on from the trials, especially because the 2013 games show us technologies that seem like the finished products, the improvements upon the discoveries made during Lathe 2. Simon Peacock says something very much along these lines in the Murkoff account comics. People have compared the Skinnerman from the Outlast Trials to the Walrider or the Laudermilch Demon in the 2013 games. These all seem to be entities of arguably supernatural origin, but Outlast 1's Walrider does have some kind of scientific explanation in nanomachines. Dr. Easterman, the director of Lathe 2, at first wanted to write off the Skinnerman as an irrelevant byproduct of the therapy, because his primary focus was on making sleeper agents out of the reagents. But Easterman is very clearly wrong. The Skinnerman might be more important than any of his findings across the entirety of the Trials project. Like what Simon Peacock says, could the Skinnerman also be a rough draft version of the Walrider or of entities like the Laudermilch Demon? These three entities, what they all have in common is that they feed off of and are produced by intense trauma. But it wasn't until the idea of the Walrider was perfected that Murkoff saw the incredible potential for power and profit in a supernatural entity like this. The masterpiece that is the Walrider is almost completely unkillable, controlled psychologically and from a distance, and can kill anyone or anything on command and without cost. And it can take control of emailable ants. Of course, keeping the Walrider obedient to Murkoff's whims didn't turn out to be so easy, but that's another story. You can see why Murkoff would be so infatuated with the idea of producing and controlling an entity like this. It's possible that once Easterman or the other scientists realize the untapped power that the Skinnerman represents, they might drop the idea of producing sleeper agents entirely. That would be one way that the trials comes to an end. And you run a quick cost-benefits analysis, I think it looks a lot cheaper and a lot less burdensome to get a few good scientists together who can torture one singular candidate into controlling a supernatural entity, rather than going to all the effort of recruiting tens of thousands of reagents to run through this very intensive and laborious trial process, which requires probably just as many hands on deck at every moment of the day to make function properly. So this is one kind of pivot the Llama facility might have taken. There is another, and it has to do with the radio towers I mentioned earlier. Currently in the lore of the Outlast Trials, we are in the middle of learning how Sylvan Noth, post-rebirth, was guided by some strange metal-related internal compass to travel to the Havasupai reservation, very near to the location of the Llama facility. We know that eventually this is where he found his religious cult and town, Temple Gate. I wonder if the radio towers were built in response to the founding of this town. I am thinking hard right now, and I'm pretty sure we have no confirmation as to when Murkoff built these towers, nor when they discovered the technology behind these radio blasts, which produce the traumatic hallucinations. It might be something they learned through Lathe too, who knows. The means of supernatural control through the manipulation of Temple Gate is a little bit harder to understand than the way the Walrider is born, but for this video's purposes, we don't need to try to understand it. We just need to trust Murkoff has reasons, profitable reasons, for why they want to drive all these religious cultists to madness. And as I said, this might be another avenue which causes Murkoff to give up on Lathe 2 and switch focuses. In any case, I think I'm making it clear that I don't believe the trials will continue until the present day. It feels much more likely that they will come to some kind of end or repurposing, probably sooner rather than later, and this might even be in alignment with the reality that Red Barrels is dealing with, that the Outlast Trials is a live service game that will one day have to shut down its servers. They've said that they want to keep things going as long as possible, but they are an indie company with aspirations to release other titles, and to continue servicing the Outlast Trials is undeniably going to slow them down in that department. If the trials end in-game and in real life, it will almost certainly have an accompanying climactic lore event or reveal which will tie up the loose ends this prequel has created. Funnily enough, this would not be the first time Red Barrels has provided in-universe explanations which run parallel to the real-world happenings of the studio themselves. The Rebirth Protocol was shut down between late April till mid-July, and in lore, this was Easterman punishing the reagents for trying to escape the facility using Amelia's preparations. In the real world though, Red Barrels just wanted to rework the Rebirth system, and so they had to shut it down during this time. In a similar instance, if you've watched the Making of the Outlast Trials documentary, Red Barrels revealed the developmental issues they had, in which they basically had to recreate all their Trials gameplay systems with a more cohesive narrative direction in mind. I think this is mirrored in the lore, where Lathe 1 comes to a total collapse and it ends up being wholly replaced with the new ideologies supporting Lathe 2. Back on topic, sorry. When we try to figure out what a lore-rich finale will look like for this game, we have to ask, where does the self-contained lore of the Outlast Trials have left to go? A lot of the story has already happened and been told. Can I give the fastest recap of all time? We started with the Cold War and the American government's perceived need for brainwashing research. Enter the CIA's recruitment of Easterman and his installment at Murkoff's Llama facility. Easterman created Lathe 1, which was a failure. The experimental population turned out to be a fruitless bunch. Lathe 2 was later initiated to great success. The trials programs continued to grow and prosper as reagents were successfully turned into sleeper agents who could carry out ideologically motivated missions around the globe. Easterman made his gradual descent into madness at the same time Amelia was putting together her escape. Amelia was captured after the escape was executed. Easterman regained his sanity, but he is also stranger than ever. That's basically where we're at. I'm not even covering all the peripheral storylines, of course. I only want to talk about the stuff that has the most direct implications for the future of the trials themselves. And from this recap, the characters whose unfinished arcs stand out to me most are Easterman's and Amelia's. It is interesting to me how often I've heard people claiming that Amelia's story is over. What? Because her escape is finished and she's been captured, I guess? If anything, that only makes her latent agency all the greater, even though she's been put on the back burner for a couple months, and even if she herself will no longer accomplish any great feats, it is clear Murkoff and Easterman have their own purposes for her. Whichever way the wind blows, she is being set up for something even bigger and grander than what we saw in her at first. I want us not to forget how we heard Amelia's voice instead of Easterman's whispering to us during the loading screens.
Gottlieb Avellanos.
We saw her on the televisions, heard her on the radio. These are all the same means of communication Easterman has employed to reach all of us reagents.
Jesus Christ, this might actually work.
And how exactly did Easterman end up manifesting in our minds? As the Skinner Man, this supernatural egregore. We've had this term, egregore, cropping up in the evidence documents ever since Amelia's story began. It's about the influence an individual has on the minds of the people. If Easterman represents fear and discipline to us reagents, Amelia represents hope and freedom. John Red Llama Outlast speaks aptly on Amelia potentially spawning a counter-egregore to Easterman's Skinnerman, meaning Amelia might manifest for us a supernatural entity of her own. I mean, you don't even need to watch this video because my ideas pale in comparison to what Red Llama has cooked up here. Anyway, there is some overlap between our ideas. If you actually did read what he wrote up, you'll note the similarities in what I'm about to say. Maybe right now I am entering baseless conjecture territory, but this is my thinking. Even if Murkoff does their best to torture Amelia or make an example of her to us, she looms too large in our deeply traumatized minds to be suppressed or washed away. If the Skinner Man brings us pain, catatonia, and death, despite the fact that he is a completely intangible entity, could it be that Amelia's egregore will have the opposite effects? Would we gain superhuman strength and power when under the influence of the Amelia Skinner woman? And perhaps we reagents would use these newfound powers to overthrow the guards and scientists in the Signal facility, making yet another escape and giving Murkoff ever more reason to shut the trials down? It's the coinciding of these two events, Murkoff's realization of the profit in the supernatural and the uncontrollable security risks presented by the Lathe 2 project. I think these combined would be the strongest factors convincing Murkoff to shut the trials down. It's Amelia herself, as well as Cornelius Noakes, the kidnapped engineer of the Outlast Trials, who can't stop talking about how everything in the facility is falling apart. I don't know if these voice lines were meant only to foreshadow the April 8th escape, or if they're also meant to continue foreshadowing the downfall of the trials as a whole. Would it be nice if we saw, in a final security breach and escape, Noakes gets to run free and return to his family? That would be a very happy thing for his character. How did Noakes end up in the conversation? I was talking about Amelia. And when it comes to her, I can't neglect to mention the other theories. Some people wonder if Murkoff might turn Amelia into an X-Pop, the trickster whose face is teased in this unlockable profile icon. But I think Amelia's character has been too heavily invested into to end up as just another boring old X-Pop. To me, that would be disappointing and unambitious. Or maybe that would be the point, that anyone who tries to defy Murkoff ultimately ends up as just another inconsequential, insignificant victim. Even from that angle, I am not a fan. But speaking of victims, another theory is that Amelia will be turned into a proper trial victim, one who we murder at the end of a trial, like the snitch, the judge, the prosecutor, the politician. But this theory also falls flat to me because, from Murkoff's perspective, it should be a huge shame that we can only murder Amelia once, and only a maximum of 4 reagents could be the ones to murder her. Isn't that a waste of her potential? Maybe if the ordeal is televised on repeat to all reagents in all the sleep rooms ever, then Murkoff could feel they made good use of her death? Or they can do something strange and unprecedented and have a bunch of groups of reagents enter consecutively into this theorized Amelia trial, and each group of reagents cuts off a tiny little piece of her each time so that as many reagents as possible are forced to participate in her torture and death. The death by 1,000 cuts was largely a myth, but I would not be surprised if Murkoff made of it a reality. Still, as gruesome and as Murkoff-like as these ideas are, I still favor the Amelia egregore idea. I think it is what the story of the Outlast franchise not only demands, but deserves. The possible conclusions for Easterman's arc are much less clear-cut to me. During Amelia's escape, it almost looked like Easterman was coming to his end. I thought his descent into madness would find no bottom, he would spiral beyond the point of return, and then Murkoff would have to liquidate him in a very ironically fitting and horrible way. But he got back on his feet, and now he's doing better than ever, and I don't imagine Red Barrels is going to rerun the madness plot when it comes time to wrap things up. So when we think of where Easterman is going to go from here nowadays, I think we should use the facts of the present day to help us out. Remember what I said earlier. First, we have never heard Easterman's name before in the 2013 games. Second, Red Barrels has to find a way to explain why that is, why he has been shrouded in secrecy through all these decades. For this, I find it hard to come up with answers that sound decent or satisfying. We could just shrug it all off and say that it's because Murkoff is just such an unimaginably massive corporation that they have dozens of enormous scale unethical projects that we've never even heard of, and the Outlast Trials is just a pebble in the pond. Pauline Glick in the comics mentions a morphogenic engine compatible facility named Elrich. There's the implication that there's a lot of these morphogenic engine compatible facilities, and if these are all as big as Mount Massive is, then it's no surprise that there's all these names of people and places that we've never heard of, despite their supreme importance. Easterman could be among these. But I don't know if I like this. It almost feels like a cop-out. I think in storytelling, what we are told should be considered with just as much importance as what we are not. And we are not told about Easterman, so let's go back to Wernicke and the question of why he was overseeing the trials in 1960, but eventually moved on to Mount Massive Asylum. Does that not say bad things about the fate of Lathe 2? Does that not shout out to us that Lathe 2 lost importance relative to the Walrider research being done at Mount Massive? Is it possible we don't hear about Easterman because he becomes the shame of Murkoff's loins? We know that Murkoff employees who perform meritorious service are rewarded with posthumous plaques and titles, and unflattering portraits on the Mount Massive Asylum walls. Clyde Perry is our prime example of this. He was honored in death even in spite of his shortcomings and betrayals in Easterman's eyes. But what happens when the opposite occurs? If Easterman ends up failing or disappointing Murkoff badly enough, is it possible they would want to vanish him from their historical records, to say that he made no meaningful contributions, that he never even existed? It would be another instance of very fitting irony to disappear Easterman himself from the records when the whole project of Lathe 2 was built around disappearing vulnerable American citizens. And this would as well be our explanation for why we don't end up hearing a word of him or his work by the time the 2013 games come along. I think I would like this. Easterman could easily be condemned by Murkoff in the event that he is held responsible for another security breach like I mentioned earlier, such as Amelia gaining enough power as an egregore to fuel the reagent rebellion a second time. Wouldn't it be seen as Easterman's fault for choosing to keep Amelia alive and put her on display, rather than quelling her influence immediately? He would be doubly incriminated, first for not keeping the trials under control, and second for failing to recognize the entity of true power and importance, not the sleeper agents, but rather the supernatural entity of the egregore. Earlier on in the game's story, there were theories that Easterman's arc would lead him to become a prime asset. I think this is much less likely knowing what we know nowadays. Prime assets are largely about charisma, and egregores are as well, but I am thinking that egregore is a step above the prime assets, which makes sense in Easterman's case. He is the one in control of the prime assets after all. Now, I've been providing a lot of evidence and possible reasons for why the trials would fall apart or be shut down in the end. I think we should look at what that might actually look like, and why it would make for a fitting finale. Because the process of shutting down the trials, it's not just Murkoff saying, okay guys, no more trials, let's pack up and head home. They have all these leftover X-Pop and prime assets and reagents and trials environments left to contend with. Are all these people going to be killed, as was about to happen at the end of Lathe 1? Are they going to be repurposed? And what of the staff, especially the ones who are deemed high risk for spilling Murkoff's secrets? Will some be killed as well? Will others be transferred to Mount Massive or other Murkoff projects? And will they be transferred as patients or as staff? And many different things could happen. There are many different ways this could play out. Maybe word will spread that all the trial inhabitants are going to be liquidated, and that's what triggers one final escape attempt by the reagents. Maybe even the reagents and X-Pop band together to make their escape. Maybe Murkoff will think it's simplest to just burn the facility to the ground or load it with explosives, and you can play as a reagent who tries to flee the chaos and into the Arizonan wilderness. Maybe, as Red Llama believes, Amelia herself will burn down the facility through her egregore, and that's how we make our escape. But maybe Murkoff also wants to keep all of us alive and transfers us to become patients at Mount Massive Asylum for early Walrider and morphogenic engine research. And maybe Murkoff also doesn't want to burn the trials to the ground, they want to preserve Scarfiotti's beautiful work for future use. Or maybe the trials warehouses themselves get turned into the Signala radio towers, which are active during the events of Outlast 2. Dear reader, there are so many things that could happen. There are so many theories, and I hope I covered the most plausible ones in this video. But what can I say? Wernicke might turn Easterman into the very first patient for morphogenic engine therapy at Mount Massive. Doris Ritter, the shadowy dame, might snap and lead a reagent rebellion of her own because she's so angry about Murkoff turning Henrietta into the Jaeger. Nurse Emily Barlow might leak more military secrets and get taken out back. Noakes might get tortured after it's discovered he had a part to play in Amelia's escape. Simon Peacock might come back and play a role in the trials himself. He has maggots in his wounds, and that could make him important. I don't know. So you see, I didn't want to talk about every single theory, obviously, because many of the lesser espoused ones sound a little bit dumb for one reason or another, but they could still occur. Who can say what is really going to happen to us? Does it sound awesome if you get told by the author themselves that they know what happens at the end of the story? My only hope is that after the story of Trials comes to an end, and after live service is discontinued, we are still able to play the game offline, that we can play any trial we want in solo mode on any difficulty. I think they will grant us this one boon. I don't know. Is this industry standard practice? Even if it isn't, I hope red barrels can break the mold. If it turns out that we never get to enter the Signal facility ever again, I'm going to enter full psychosis in real life.